So very briefly about me. So I was saying to Gerhard, I'm very happy that he talked before me because I'm one of those true philosophers. So I was trained as a philosopher in analytic philosophy. So I did a lot of work on conceptual analysis, and my thesis was on physicalist and qualia, so basically how you connect subjective experience with the physical matter, which is the brain, to get the conscious experience. And right now, I'm also a cognitive neuroscientist, so I work with people at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience in London. I'm basically sort of like philosopher in residence, and my job there in the lab meetings is to ask annoying questions, like conceptual questions, like what do you mean by perception? And they hate me, right? What do you mean by experience? Well, obviously we know what it's like, okay. But I think one question that is really worthwhile asking is there something special about subjective experiences? So about the fact that actually we are subject of an experience, right? And philosophers like to make distinctions. Philosophers like to make refinements of like how we map the world. And for instance, one very common distinction that philosophers make is between subjective feel, like there is something for you to have that experience, and also minus, or for meanness. It's like the idea that all experiences are implicitly given as my experiences. And why I think this is a very important question, it's a fundamental human question about our mind in general, because no matter how we look at this world to try to understand it, we cannot escape the fact that our access to the world is necessarily through our personal experience, our subjective point of view, right? So we cannot escape the fact that we can use whatever tool we like. They're all going to be used from that subjective, unique first-person experiences. And we are all here unique, right? And here is the puzzle that we have. Can we have a science of consciousness, which science in general means objective methods, blah, 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 knowing that basically we can have, in principle, as many scientists as human beings, right? Because every human experience and every subject is unique, right? So here is the big puzzle. You want to have a science of consciousness, yet you have infinite forms of consciousness. How are you going to make those, right? So I found, for me as a philosopher, that's a problem that is worthwhile exploring. So I dedicated my career to try to, dig into that problem. And what I was trying to convince you today with my talk is something very basic, namely that sometimes the most important things are those you can't see it and you take it for granted, especially when it comes to consciousness. And I'd like you to look at the metaphor of a tree. And why a tree? Because, well, when you walk in the street, you all see trees, right? You can see, but you see them from here, right? And sometimes, there's a root coming, right? But typically you don't see the roots, right? But it would be a mistake to try to understand the tree without understanding how the tree nourishes, right, from the roots, right? And what I want to say today is like when we tackle the problem of consciousness, maybe we focus on just this part, the visible part, and kind of overlook the invisible part of the iceberg, so to speak. And I want to say that the invisible part of our conscious experience is something that we have before any conscious experience, but it's necessarily the same part of the same phenomena, right? You cannot have this without this. And this is what I will call, in line with some phenomenologists, the pre-reflective experience or pre-reflective self-consciousness, right? And that is rooted in the body. Because I did my thesis on physicalism and qualia, I was a physicalist, and I basically defended the idea that you can have a body without a mind, but you cannot have a mind without a body. So this means that everything supervenes on the physical. Again, you have this is the roots, this is the fundamental roots. So yeah, so that's the basic idea. And what I want to say also is that typically in our everyday life, we have something that is called subjectivity or sense of self that is typically taken for granted. And it's with us all the time, but we don't realize it. And we can use, I like to use Thomas Metzinger metaphor of the transparency of our sense of self, right? So you can think of this kind of like sense of self, like a transparent window. and gives you the illusion that actually you're in direct contact with reality. But in reality, there is something mediating that kind of like access, and that's the sense of self, right? It is the transparent window. And there's obviously a debate whether, you know, the self or the sense of self is an illusion or there is something real. I want to say that that invisible, transparent kind of feature is a real feature of our world and our experiences that typically is transparent, take it for granted. And how can I prove that, right? Well, one way to look at it is like, imagine there is a crack in the window, right? If there's a crack in the window, then two things happen. First of all, you realize that there is something there before you thought there was nothing, right? The crack gives you the hint that there is an object there between, mediating, right? And now, because there is a crack, your immersion into the reality and your idea of being in direct touch with the world is hindered, right? Is shattered, right? So two things appear. And this is what I'm going to present you the case of a disorder. It's called depersonalization disorder, in which basically exactly what is happening is like that transparency of the sense of self is disrupted. So hence I can prove that you cannot lose something that you don't have. So you have the sense of self, but in this case, it's kind of like disrupted. Sorry, that was not. But before I'm going to do that, I'm going to step back a bit and to do some conceptual work. It's like looking at the history of ideas and the history of philosophy. Because when I started my thesis on physicalism and qualia on the mind-body problem, one of the first question I asked myself is like, why do we have this distinction, right? The mind and the body. And then, well, I realized that basically as human creatures and as animals, we all have one big desire. And that desire is to live, right? We want to continue living. And you can see this very, very easily, even in cases, for instance, if you want to try to kill yourself, right? You cannot kill yourself by ordering your cells to stop doing what they do for your self-preservation, right? They will fight up until the last drop for you, against you, right? So there is a type of like self-preservation which is basic, which is there as human living creatures, human living organisms, and animals. We have this drive, we want to live and potentially reproduce, but we want to live, right? And I think behind this kind of like mind-body distinction, there is this idea that somehow you see the body disappearing, right? Because when somebody dies, the body disappears, right? And decomposes. And that's very puzzling. And that's very scary. So people, I think, they tried somehow to hang on to something that doesn't disappear and shouldn't be material, because material body is kind of like disappear, right? So there is this distinction that you have a material body and you have an immaterial soul, right? And is the very root of what Greek will say, calling the soma-sema picture. Soma, body, sema, tomb. So they were saying that the body is the tomb for the soul, right? And basically whatever is happening here is just like transitory, right? It's like the body is just a tomb in which your soul has been trapped. But once you die, your body reaches, your soul, your true being, so to speak, reaches a different level, which is the immaterial one, which is the good one, right? The material is bad, immaterial is good. Why? Because this one disappears, this one doesn't, right? At least this is what we think, right? So we have this kind of like very, very basic rooted distinction that we have in our market. And then from that picture, we inherited Western philosophy, we inherited a couple of like points, right? Very big points. I'm going to walk you through them. So the first one is that the conscious mind is an inner realm connected to the outside world via the senses, to which only the I has privileged access and about which it has incorrigible knowledge. So only I know exactly what I want to, I think what I feel. The self forms the self-evident starting point of entire philosophical system. That's the Cartesian cogito. The mind is a different sort of entity from the body, as I said. so much that it does not depend on the existence of the body for its functioning. And the mind can, in fact, grasp the nature of reality far more easily when it's not encumbered by the attachment to anything corporeal. So we inherited this kind of like background to that from kind of like distinction. And so basically, this is the mind-body problem drawn by myself. This is taken from my thesis, so bear with me. So do you know that the Descartes solved the mind-body problem by putting a pineal gland, right, between, and now the problem with the human being in itself is like it's torn between material and immaterial because it has a body, obviously it's material, an immaterial mind. So the human being is a life-size pineal gland, right, torn between two ontological different realms. And why is this important, right? So going back to the reality. Well, I'm going to give you a couple of examples why I think this is important. First of all, because we have institutions that are treating disease, illnesses differently. So if you have a mind disease, you go into mental health institution. If you have a body disease, you go, if you're a liver disease, you go to like hospital, right? So we have institutions that basically kind of like rooted the kind of like distinction, right? The second one is more related with the future. Now we try to build artificial selves, right? Artificial like us, right? And how we do it? Either we create artificial minds, like intelligence, right? On one hand, either we create artificial bodies, and then again we have the mind-body problem, how we connect, the artificial mind to artificial body, and it's like again and again, the same loop, right? But I want to take a very different perspective on this and question that distinction from the very first place, right? And actually, this comes from Twitter, right? So it's like it's an exchange coming from Twitter. As you know, right now we have a very huge trend on computational things. So we have computation of everything. Somebody very excited tweeted, it's like, oh, bad news for psychiatrists. They will have to learn mathematics and statistics, to do computational modeling of whatever's wrong in depressed brains. So, and somebody retweeted back. They said, oh, bad news for mathematicians. They'll have to go to hospital and speak to the patients, right? So, so the idea is that, again, I said, oh, this is actually my problem, right? It's like this is my thesis. Like, how can you connect the fact that it's like, okay, whatever you model there, you cannot escape the fact that actually has to be gathered from a person, right? A subjective kind of experience, right? So this is the basic, right, kind of like approach that I want to take, right? Okay, so this is the roadmap very quickly. So I'm going to introduce you very quickly to some very basic definitions. I know it's late, but they're very short. I put a lot of pictures. And then I'm going to contrast two cases when basically one loses the sense of self. Remember the transparent window. And I want to say, in the case of depersonalization, the case of meditation, and I know that meditation means a lot of things. I have a paper on this, but I'm going to use Buddhist-based meditation for this talk. And I want to make the claim against contra Metzinger that the self is not illusory, cannot be lost. It just transforms. It's to transform from one thing to another. And because the organizer asked me to come up with open question, I will come up with 3 questions for you at the end, okay? So very quickly, very basic philosophical take on what is like a subject to perceive, right? Subjective and perception, right? So you have the subject, the perceiving I am a perceiving subject, and the perceiving me. I can perceive myself as an object of an experience, namely I can see myself in the mirror, how you guys see me, because I can't see my face, right? So this is called the me, the object, and this is called the I, the subject, right? And typically, people define self-consciousness, so how you become aware of yourself as being a self, by taking what they call the reflective consciousness stance. So towards like, I think it's between 8 months and 12 months, depends on people, on babies. It's like, I think you know the Rouge test, right? So you play with the kid, you put some rouge on his forehead and then present it with the mirror. Until 8 months, they will look, oh, that's something interesting on the mirror. So they try to grab, the rouge in the mirror, the surface of the mirror. After that age, they realize that actually what they see is what the other sees, and they, you know, correctly direct the hand towards themselves and say, oh, that person in this mirror is basically me. So that's considered the self-consciousness. And many, many of the people, especially the computational people, they'll identify and they'll define self-consciousness in this way, right? They'll say, okay, so this is what self-consciousness means, right? Basically, involves a subject-object relation between two different mental states, the reflecting and the reflected. Basically, you see yourself as other people see you. And then this means that you are self-conscious. This means that they deny that babies before that age, they're actually self-conscious, right? Another way to look at it is to say, okay, wait a minute, that's kind of like one way to look at things, and starting from an adult-centric perspective. There are other ways to actually be self-conscious, which are way more basic, and it's called the pre-reflective self-consciousness. Phenomenological tradition actually arguing extensively in favor of this view. The self is something that's intrinsically present in each and every experience. And basically, it's very interesting that kind of like phenomenological trend, that fact that the self is necessarily embedded in every experience, is recently echoed by neuroscience approaches that say that whatever the brain does, it's not that the body is, the body is not a system to transport and fuel the mind. It's that way around. The mind evolved as a tool to satisfy the needs of a living body. It's that way around, right? So the body comes first. Always remember that. So this means that we need, so whether we like it or not, whatever we perceive as selfish. So the self-interests are necessarily embedded in all our experiences because we look up for whatever is relevant for me, right? For the survivor, because this is what I want to do. So as I said, so some recent philosophers, contemporary philosophers, they base their approach in phenomenology. They say the self-consciousness is, you cannot be conscious without being intrinsically and pre-reflectively self-conscious. So that's the basic idea. So necessarily, whenever you have a conscious experience, you have self-consciousness smuggled in, right? Your perception is necessarily selfish. But doesn't mean that the self or the subject, the self that is kind of like intrinsically present in every experience is not an object of an experience. I do not attend to a subject as being something. It's necessarily a subject of an experience, right? I know it's a very subtle distinction, but Wittgenstein, which was not a phenomenologist, but he gave a very nice example, which I capture exactly this point, which is basically a very important point. Think of the following example. So if I'd say something like, I'm falling, right? I might be wrong about the fact that I'm falling. Let's say I'm not falling, but I'm dreaming that I'm falling. I'm lying in my bed, and I'm having a dream that I'm falling. I'm not falling. So I can't be wrong about the content of my experience, but I can't be wrong about the fact that it is I who is having that experience, right? Being falling or whatever it is. So I, in that experience, I'm the subject of an experience. But if I look at myself in a mirror or in a picture, on a selfie, and I say, oh, I look awesome in the selfie, I might be wrong. Maybe it's not me. The I there, maybe it's my twin sister, okay? So I misjudge who the I is. In the first case, I can't misjudge it because the I is embedded in experience. So whenever you have an experience, necessarily the I is present there. And funnily enough, this is something that it goes with some Eastern tradition, that they coin the term the I, which is the pure subjectivity, as the I without the me. So you have you basically experience yourself as a pure subjectivity, detach it from yourself, see yourself from a third-person perspective. Now, I had this argument with Thomas many times about what he has in common with some scholar Buddhists. So they both believe that the self is an illusion, and I believe they're both wrong in that sense. And how can I prove that? I can find cases when people can say that they lose precisely what he's saying that doesn't exist, right? So I'm going to present you to the case of depersonalization. And basically what I'm going to say in the couple of next slides, if you want more information, more detailed information, it came up in this paper this year. So let's do a little exercise. I'm going to present you two self-reports, right, which basically describe roughly the same phenomena. And I want you to tell me which one is coming from a person meditating and which one is coming from a person who is having depersonalization in the sense of like self-detachment. Okay, so let's read together the first one. So my perception felt as though it had been drawn back inside my head, almost as though I was looking at the world from the back of my head and could see the back of my own eye sockets. Essentially, it felt that there was a divorce, a fracture between the world and me. So although my body was still in the world, my mind was only an observer. B, the first thing I noticed was a slight change in my vision. The change was like a camera lens zooming out, pulling back. I had the sensation that instead of looking from the front of my head, I was looking from behind through my eyes. It was very much a feeling of watching. Right? Okay. So which one we said that the first one is meditation? And the second one? Okay. And maybe this will help. This is precisely what happened after, just after the experience. There was all sensation was since I didn't even knew 1 hour before. There followed some hours of seeking reassurance for those around me, wanting to be in physical contact with them and to talk to them constantly to check if I still existed. Until exhausted, I slept in the hope that it would pass overnight. It didn't. And second, a certain calmness pervaded everything. This sensation lasted for about 50 minutes or so and then faded out, right? So this is clearly the second one is meditation, right? So this is the type of experience that you have. But this looks very much as like this kind of like pulling out, zooming out from whatever you experience. So I'm going to introduce you very, very briefly, because as I said, if you want to hear more about this, it's like you can Google our papers. Actually, we got very good news today. The first paper from the project got accepted today, so yay, so that's good. So the case of depersonalization disorder. So as you can see, this image kind of explains the sensation of like being drawn back in the head and seeing yourself and the world from your head, right? Not necessarily being on your body. And because I'm a philosopher and obviously I'm interested in phenomena like from an objective perspective, I want to measure it, I want to understand what it is. But because, as I said, I'm interested in the problem of subjectivity, right? So I want to understand the phenomena as lived from a first-person experience through the person's subjective experience. So as a part of my project, I actively engage with people suffering from depersonalization. So I attended their meetings regularly at the peer support group in London, and I was like, every 2 weeks or so, I was engaging with them and try to understand their experiences. Obviously, I didn't have access to their first-person experience, but it was very important for me to have first-hand reports for what their experience. And this is, I took just one of them as Jane's story. So in March 2022, the day before the Queen Mother died, I smoked cannabis at my boyfriend's family house in France. She was 18. And you can recognize the quote before, right? So essentially it felt that there was a divorce, a fracture between the world and me, so that my body was still in the world, my mind was only an observer. And 50 years later, she still struggles to get her sense of self back, right? So this is a kind of like this very disturbing condition. And it's very disturbing, and it's very different from other dissociative conditions like schizophrenia or psychosis. Why? Because these people have the reality testing intact. So this means that they know that whatever they experience is subjective phenomena and not the reality itself. And this is very important for treatment and actually for identifying the phenomena. So suppose if I walk with my friend and somebody taps me, I have the feeling that somebody taps me on my shoulder, and I believe that actually what I feel is reality, then I turn my head, right, to see who is behind me. And if there is nobody, my friend will see my gesture and will say, why are you looking behind you? There is nobody, right? So hence the other is kind of like, can testify for my behavior. So my behavior gives a glimpse of whatever is like happening. But if I'm depersonalized, I might have exactly the same experience, right? Somebody's, but I know that whatever I'm experiencing, that's subjective, that's not reality. Hence, I not turn my head. Hence, my friend cannot see me. What I'm experiencing, hence, I'm very alone, right? So these people take ages to get diagnosed because they know that whatever they experience is subjective. So they know there's something wrong. And they have, there are a lot of studies that show that they have a higher frontal lobe, prefrontal lobe connectivity and activity because they overthink. And they need to cope with this kind of like coping cognitive strategies because they know that whatever they experience is not the reality itself. With Jane, if you are interested, we wrote a very short piece for EON in which basically we do kind of like the phenomenological approach to this phenomena. And basically, again, we argue that there's the same thing. There's like whether the sense of self is an illusion, we say no. Very, very roughly about the condition itself, it was first coined in the beginning of the 19th century. It has been defined as a state in which the quality of subjective first-person experience is altered. So the person feels detached either from the self, depersonalization, or from the surroundings, derealization. They typically co-occur. So when you feel detached from the self, you feel also detached from reality. But you have cases in basically you can distinguish them. It is the third most common psychiatric syndrome in the general population after anxiety and low mood. And I suspect that after this pandemic, we'll have even higher incidence because of the stress. It can typically follows after severe stress, traumatic life events, or drug use. So in the case of Jane, she smoked cannabis twice, and that was the second time that actually she was smoking cannabis and she had this. And he has 4 experiential components: anomaly body experience, emotion numbing, subjective recall, and detachment from the surroundings. But again, what is really interesting about this condition is because it brings me back to this idea of like the subjective I and objective me. And there is a disruption between the two. And we had a discussion just before my talk about art, right? And why art is important and why art can be connected with conscious experience. And one example that I can give you right away is the importance of basically having artistic expression to express things that we cannot otherwise express with words. And for instance, when they try to convey the experiences, because it's so hard to say, I don't feel like myself, what do you mean? I feel detached from myself, but what do you mean? And somebody came up with this metaphor they call the snowball metaphor. And she said to me, look, imagine you have a snowball in your hand, one of those that you shake, you have snow in it, and you hold it, and you're trapped inside, and you know it's you. And I also know that the person holding the snowball is still me, but somehow I cannot connect the two, right? So I cannot connect the hand with I'm holding. It's like, I'm there, I'm here, but it's disconnected and I don't feel myself. Does it make sense? It's kind of like disrupted between the I as a subject and I as an object of an experience. They also use the metaphor of an experiential airbag. They say, imagine you have the danger of crashing against a overwhelming kind of like psychological or physical reality. The brain creates a sort of like experiential airbag, prevents you to crash against that, right? Because again, the job of the brain to keep you alive no matter what. And in this case, the brain found the solution of dissociation. Very typically, for instance, in rape cases, during the event, the victim would say something like, I completely detached, the horrible thing was happening, but not to me, right? So the brain solves the problem, the overwhelming problem of the emotion, say, okay, so this is too horrible, but you're fine because it's not happening to you. So it's like kind of like type of dissociation between the two. So, and also very, very often they say, I feel trapped in my mind, in my head, but outside the body, right? So it seems that there is kind of like distinction. And that with that in mind, we had this idea to basically contrast the experience of like self-detachment, being trapped in the head and outside the body, with whatever is happening in mindfulness and embodied meditation, Buddhist-based meditation. And what we want to say is that the crucial difference between the two is that in meditators, obviously, first of all, you have the sense of agency. You choose to go into that kind of like detachment state. It does not have something happening to you, so it does. And the second one is how you basically relate to your body. I don't know if you guys meditate, but when I first started to meditate, it was a bit annoying because they say, okay, you have to be in this position, you have to breathe this way, you know. So basically, it pays a lot of attention to basically bodily experiences, right? So what you do when before you meditate, you put your body in a certain way, such as the body becomes background and transparent. Doesn't mean you still got breathe. You still breathe. The brain is monitoring yourself. If you're okay, you need to put you in a kind of like position in which basically the bodily roots of your self-consciousness become transparent, right? You don't think of them. And then you let other things come at the surface, right? You need to put yourself in a comfortable place, blah, blah, blah. And here it's a quote, I think, from a Tarian colleague. They say, I found it very, very interesting because they say, even highly experienced meditators who have more 20,000 hours of meditative practice cannot eliminate entirely the subtle, almost invisible. Yeah, you can read it as transparent, yet still present extensive bodily feelings in the background, right? So you have the body roots present very much there. And they say, I'm not dead. There is a kind of very long sense of body in this experience, right? So again, the importance of like actually remembering that even if in meditative states you have the impression that basically your sense of self dissolves and you get lost, you lose your sense of self, you lose your ego, you dissolve yourself. This is only because your bodily self is well grounded, right? And you can afford to leave it in the background. You don't think about it anymore, right? If you have an itch and an urge to go to the toilet, immediately you realize that actually, oh, the self is still here, right? It's like, I need to keep track of that self, right? Okay, so what we argue in the paper, I don't have the time to enter into details here, that meditative techniques enhance the transparency and the openness of the window towards more like unifying states. This is why you feel fully awake and alive, because I know that Thomas Metzinger is meditator, and I was asking him, how do you feel in the state? Do you feel dead? He said, no, I feel very much alive. But the depersonalization people, they feel actually dead, right? They feel like robots, like machines. Depersonalization states breaks the window of transparency and enhance what they call, Thomas Fuchs also calls it self-opacity. So this kind of, I remember when I told you the crack in the window, two things appear. First of all, I realized there was something there. And the second is like, because there is a crack, think of a tube or train where the window is like one of those security windows. If there is a crack, there's kind of like tiny little pieces, and you cannot see anymore through the window, right? So it's like opaque and blurs, like the immersion of feelings. And actually, this is how they experience, and they report like a lack of immersion into the reality. However, what I want to say in that paper is like, just as opening or breaking a window doesn't make the window disappear altogether, losing the sense of self in that sense, and the depersonalization meditation, that doesn't make it vanish. It just transforms. It's in a different form, right? And I'm going to end with a couple of thoughts that is connected with this idea that pre-reflective embodied self is invisible roots of all our conscious experience, and we have to take into consideration whenever we analyze conscious experience the entire tree, right? I want to add one element to this. And this is another line of work that I'm pursuing right now. And I start with this kind of like basic observation that whenever we start to investigate something, we are already adults, and necessarily the lens that we're using is that of an adult-centric perspective. But when you look at conscious experience, like from like, so let's say like bottom up, unfolding, dynamics perspectives, how they, so if you ask yourself, not what is a conscious experience, but how consciousness emerge, how experiences arise, right? Then you have to go back to square one. And this is, I agree with Wolford when we said, the famous poets, who said, when it comes to understanding perception, the infant is father to the man, right? or the human, sorry. He said man, but we said we need to say human. So if you want to understand how experience unfolds, you need to go back to score one to see how they unfold dynamically in real life. And if you do that, then you realize that actually our experiences and our first perception arise when we share our body with the body of another person, namely our mothers. So we have a wealth of data right now that show that basically we already have experiences in the womb. So we have perceptions already in the womb. It's not the mainstream approach, right? But I think one of the problems that we kind of overlooked at this fact is the idea that being pregnant is kind of like dedicated with, let's say, a group of individuals within the humanity, right? Not everyone can be pregnant. But if you take the other perspective, right, of the fetus, of the infant, then whether you like it or not, all human beings to date came to the world this way, right? So the experience, the shared experience and the shared embodiment is fundamental, it's basic. We all came into this world through this channel, right? It's embodied and it's shared. So this means that this complicates the picture, right? We don't have just one tree, we have two trees, right? And actually this is a simple case because you can also have twins, right? So this means that we have a space of a shared experience, and I'm basically writing 2 papers right now precisely on this, connecting with some recent work done in neuroscience and predictive processing and all that kind of like approaches, is that if it's true that whatever we experience now is based on what we experienced before, and we use the lens of our prior experiences, then necessarily we have to go back and see this case. We need to take it into consideration, whether we like it or not. And this is, as I said, is I think what I would like to do in collaboration with my colleagues in London is basically we want to argue and we want to question the very idea that consciousness study have focused too much on visual perception, right? So how we consciously perceive an apple, perceive the environment, blah, blah, blah. But the visual, spatial, visual, it's like, remember even I myself, when I put the example of a conscious experience, I put that person seeing herself, right? So it's kind of like visual distance. But this is not how we experience ourselves in the world in the first step, right? Vision in the womb develops very slowly, right? We see babies see very few things, actually, very slowly. Basically, the oldest and the largest of our organs is the skin. And basically, this is how we perceive the world from the start by touching it, right? And remember that we are a liquid, right? So basically, this is how we feel the body. We feel the body by being touched, right? And we have this kind of very nice work by Merleau-Ponty saying that the touch is a very special sense because it's necessarily subject and object. If I'm touching myself, I'm in the same time simultaneously subject and object of my experience, right? So touch is very, very important, precisely because of this, that idea of being reciprocal, right? You cannot touch without being touched back, right? And it is very interesting is that anecdotally, I can tell you, I am planning to run a couple of studies on this to actually have more data to pinpoint the idea. But anecdotally, I know, remember what Jane said, is like whenever she felt depersonalized and out of touch with herself, the first instinct was to actually be in physical contact with other things, right? So to get a sense of reality in the self, what you do, you touch things, right? So, and why is this? Is because let's say I've lost track of my hand. I don't know where my hand is. If I put my hand here, the information that I receive from what is not my hand gives me intrinsic information where my hand is, right? So I get the eye for free, right? So this is how we get conscious ourselves from the very beginning, through tactile, multisensory interaction, because, well, I focus on touch, but basically we have also auditory impulses and also smell and everything. But what is really interesting, one other thing that I would like to share with you is like something that we don't know too much, but this is a fascinating field and we should do actually more. It says basically you innervate, fetuses innervate their own limbs by touching. So the more they touch themselves, the more nerves actually they, it's a basic overflow of self-creating, right, in a way, right, the self-touch, right? And it's a very, very nice approach. And I want to end because we were talking about arts and consciousness. So this is a kind of like platform that we're putting in place. We were planning to launch it this year in October, but pandemic kind of like changed our plans in Porto. So we want to do, because I'm French, I want to make la résistance. I want to resist, you know, to protest against, you know, this tendency that the future has to actually block someone, stuck some people in the head statically in the chairs, you know, in a very individualistic way. And basically, because I'm taking this approach, as I said, this is our roots, and this is very important, right? We have to go back to that. So we want to do research interdisciplinary fashion with not just scientists, but also artists and performers and policymakers, basically in which we use the way we relate to an environment and to our body as a way to actually basically understand our conscious experience and our sense of self. So we want to take off the armchair, off the lab, and basically connect with other disciplines, with other perspectives. And I have my main coordinators is Andreas Roepstorff from the Interactive Mind Center in Denmark, and Davis Harris-Smith in Toronto, Canada. I don't know, he was famous. He was involved in a very famous project, and maybe some of you know, it's the Hitchbot. You know, the robot was kind of like the one who got murdered in Philadelphia, you know. So what, he got murdered in Philadelphia. No, he was like decapitated, yeah. So they created a robot, a Hitchbot, so he was like trying to get from point A from point B, and there's a chatbot, right? It's about anthropomorphizing actually objects, right? It's how people project into other objects like, and basically the chatbot would the only thing to say, hello, my name is, I want to go to, and people say, oh, come on in. And they took him in the car, he participated in weddings, and you know, he got promoted, he got medals and everything. And then he had a very bad idea to travel into the States. He went to Europe as well, he came back safely. I mean, he traveled a long way, right? And then he did the mistake to go to the States. And one day in Philadelphia, he got murdered. Somebody took his head. And actually the second day, the New York Times actually did the front page was the obituary of the, you know, so that was kind of like, this is how human reacts to objects, which is actually very important, especially now when I'm going to have more and more robots with us. And because the organizer asked me to come up with 3 open questions, so I have 3 open questions for you. I think they're important. I think in the field, in all fields, actually, there is a misunderstanding, and we need to clarify what do you mean by an experience and what do you mean by perception. I think in many disciplines, people say, oh, a robot perceives his own body, hence he is self-conscious, right? Is that an experience? What is an experience? What is a perception? I think that's very important. Again, do artificial minds and body experience or perceive the world, if there is a difference in the first one? And the third one is the one that actually I started, you know, my talk today is like, can we have a basic and objective science of consciousness for all of us, given that necessarily our conscious experience are fundamentally subjective and unique. And that's all. I want to thank you for your attention.